When you're looking for a big overarching investment like that, is that something where or organizing structure rather, is that something where you think, here's the theme of this paper that I want to get across, here are the results, because that's a really interesting take on scientific writing, which to me I've often thought of as one of those areas where the theme isn't as clear. If you have a results section, there's always like each section does these really specific things, but they're not, I guess, in my conception of it, a thematic thing in the way that maybe research has.
The theme is interesting because the theme is coming from really a whole body of work that you've already published. Mm-hmm. And my colleagues and I have published about 175 journal papers in my career, and they're related to one another. So a paper that we do and publish tomorrow is related to a body of work for the last 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. So every single paper has the context of that body of work. So when you're looking at themes, it's how these sets of experiments and these results and findings relate to the body of work that was done just before it, and how that was related to a body of work just before it, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm always looking at is in discussing with co-authors is that when we're going to present something, let's make sure it's in the context of that work. So it's exactly doesn't just sit out there as an isolated piece of literature that's not related to the theories and themes of the work that we've been working on for many years.
Have you encountered a point where something really unexpected happened that sort of set itself off from your results, and you thought, oh, this sort of repudiates something that came forward,
yes,
takes it very well?
What do you do then? We have instances where we have disproved a line of work that we were working on. And part of the interesting things about science is that you're actually proposing hypotheses that are sitting out there to be tested, and they're really there to be disproved. That's the way science really works, or not supported. That's what we're really trying to test. And so we've never been afraid to admit that we're wrong, or that our theory needs to be altered or changed to incorporate these new findings. In fact, one of the most interesting things about hypothesizing and theorizing and writing is this sort of malleable nature of your ideas, because you go in with a certain preconception of the way you think it ought to work, but science is interesting. It doesn't often work that way.
Okay. So you've got all this experience writing for psychology. I'm curious, in these high-level journals, I'm curious how you negotiate sort of genre differences with your position as a provost. Or how do you go from writing for the psychology journals? Is there a very different mindset you take on to write for a general academic release?
Yeah, there's a very, very big difference in those two. There's a tendency in the scientific writing for psychology and neuroscience journals to really be very succinct. And it's almost as if there's a cost to every word when it gets reviewed and when it finally gets published. I think sometimes that's not good, but that's the way scientific writing it tends to be. It's very exact, precise, it follows format, etc. When I'm in the mode of writing about things academic in nature that's related to my role as Vice Provost and Executive Dean, I'm often writing for much general audiences than that. In the audiences sometimes are faculty members, sometimes students, sometimes parents. So in a lot of respects I look at that writing like public speaking is, in that I'm transmitting more general ideas, and I tend to use more examples, I think, from real world than you would in scientific writing, in those kinds of writing. And the form is completely different, because you're trying to get away from this formalness, I think, and into a more informal mode, because you want it to be interesting to the audience. And scientists can get interested in something that's written rather dryly and succinctly because that's what they expect. I think you lose your audience if I was writing for students and their parents and writing in that same format. So I tend to be, I think, warmer in the writing and more informal. If I think that's the best way to describe it.
So there are no citations and footnotes to the public
Rarely.
releases. Rarely.
Rarely.
You're not doing the Dave Eggers thing of the giant footnotes.
No.
Okay. Now, you've studied the neurobiology of human learning, memory, and cognitive function, and we talked a little bit about this before we started taping. And I'm curious, given the huge part that memory and cognitive function play in writing, have you found anything in your research that's sort of applicable to writing that made you think, oh, well, this sort of explains why I prefer to look at the overarching piece before I look at the little small bricks that make it up, as you said earlier?
Yeah, unfortunately, most of my work in the cognitive area has been really looking at the individual bricks and not at larger pictures. The only areas that we've looked at that may be applicable to writing are in the areas of decision making and general cognition, in the role that the brain plays in making decisions. That could be applicable, but we just never looked at it that way. Writing is such a complex activity, and most of my research has gone in the other direction. I'm trying to simplify complex processes, and I've just never thought of such a process like writing as being that dissociable, like I can movement and other kinds of learning that's much more simpler than writing is.
Okay. That's interesting because as the executive dean of arts and sciences, you're sort of straddling two, in some ways, very disparate kind of
about
fields.
50 disparate fields.
Well, I was thinking arts here and science is here, but I'm really curious. We've got a really big push right now for the STEM initiatives: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. How, with a push like that, how does humanities surface? How does the humanities and valuing writing, how does it survive in an environment that's pushing the STEM initiatives as much as it is?
Well, as much as we're in love of advancing the STEM initiatives and how important they are, I think from our perspective here at Ohio State, the humanities still are extremely important and still get a lot of our attention, not as a service industry for STEM, but really for in their own right. Our ability to encourage the next generation of authors and historians, et cetera, still excites everybody. But there is a component that makes the humanities extremely important for STEM. And when I talk about the importance that writing has in the STEM fields, in communicating the ideas that are found in engineering and mathematics and science, it is through the efforts of the humanities and people who teach writing and composition that I think those basic skills are learned. So that's one aspect of the humanities that's very, very important to STEM. I'd hate to see what the STEM areas would be if we didn't have a strong writing education component what we're doing. We'd have a lot of scientists that couldn't communicate any ideas.